I am happy to introduce Glen David Gold to all of you. Glen is a critically acclaimed writer whose essays and short stories has appeared in various publications such as McSweeney's, Playboy, and the New York Times Magazine. He has written two novels, including his debut, Carter Beats the Devil. In the review of the book, the New York Times has said, "The artfulness of Carter Beats the Devil rests both in Gold's ability to unfurl a story before our eyes and in his crackerjack skill at recapturing a lost era." Today, he will be talking about his new memoir, I Will Be Complete. In it, he tells the colorful, surprising, and heartbreaking story of his own life. It started on a high note. Gold was born in 1964 to wealthy Southern Californians, but in short order, his father left, his parents divorced, and when he was 12, his mother moved to New York without telling him. Left to fend for himself, Gold did just that. With wit and a remarkable insight honed by his unstable circumstances, he recreates his experiences adjusting to boarding school, working at an independent bookstore in Los Angeles, participating in a punk rock riot, falling in love, and becoming a writer. In their review of the book, Kirkus Reviews calls I Will Be Complete a strong memoir that oozes with the excitement of a life well lived and well analyzed. Ladies and gentlemen, Glen David Gold.
Too attractive a chair not to throw something into like that. Howdy, can you all hear me through this? Great, cool. Hi, I'm Glen David Gold, and I'm going to read to you for about 13 minutes from the very beginning of my memoir, I Will Be Complete. Then I'm going to say a couple things about it, and then we will talk. So, well, actually, there's no setup. It's the beginning of the book, so we'll do that. A note on the accuracy of the text. My mother assures me none of this happened. I think you're an adult when you can no longer tell your life story over the course of a first date. I might have gotten this idea from my parents because they reinvented themselves so often. Their stories have odd turns which speak not of one life, but of many that don't seem to match up, and of choices you'd think no one would actually make. When I was 12 years old, I lived by myself for a while. This was the mid-1970s in San Francisco, so the rules were a little different then, and yet not so different that me living alone made much sense. When I describe what happened, people tend to ask, but how did you end up so... They dance around the word normal, and then they realize it doesn't apply. And instead they say, so nice. I'm not nice. I'm polite. Nice is a quality. Polite is a strategy. But I have ended up happy. Also, I've ended up something more unusual than that, autonomous. I have a good memory, but lately I've been looking for people who might know more, and I've come up empty. Life in the 1970s led to a lot of bad luck and unintended consequences. Perversely, I'm relieved when some of the people I want to talk to turn out to be dead. But then I find one man I don't actually want to, Peter Charming. He's almost invisible, but I'm good at research. He has no business licenses. He doesn't own property in his name. The house he lived in when I knew him turns out to have belonged to somebody else, and even his 1970s phone number is assigned to a different person in old directories. I can't find any criminal records, though those are difficult to get to the bottom of. The San Francisco Superior Court, however, provides some sheet music in a way, and it's up to me to imagine the score. There are civil lawsuits. In some, he's the defendant, and others, the plaintiff. One of them went on for 7 years and struggled all the way to trial twice. There are ways the mind pushes back against knowing too much. You research too long. You obsess over irrelevant details. Your memories tend to come in snapshots without context. You amaze the world by how unfazed, by how nice you seem. You discount cruelties as if they're anecdotes best brought out in barroom competitions. You also tend to say you when you mean I. When I was a kid, Peter was bad to my mom. She managed to escape eventually, but at a cost. I don't know if the damage he inflicted upon her was worse financially or emotionally. In our family, money is a convenient cipher for the wounds that are harder to qualify. Accounting for his charisma and his promises, you could reduce him to an elemental force that moved my mother and me forward, then backward, and then apart. My mother is much more important, but when I think of looking directly at her, I reflexively retreat into research. I would rather look into Peter's life again. People leave San Francisco, but something always gets left behind. Usually it's gossip. I've mentioned his name to people who were in that social circle, and it's like he never existed. I'm sure they met him, and I don't think they're lying when they say they don't remember. He was of a time and a place that are long gone. It's like asking about a statue in a park that's now the site of a high-rise. What happened to that old bronze bust? Don't you remember it? His picture is in the society column of the San Francisco Chronicle in the late 1960s, and he looks young. He hasn't learned arrogance yet. Instead, he looks just shy of self-confident, like he's asking the camera to confirm that it sees him as handsome. He's an escort for women who are older. They have their own money, and my hunch is that when they stopped seeing Peter, they still had all of it, minus what they'd knowingly given him. That was before the 1970s, the time that was made for him. One person reacted to his name once. At a party sometime in the 1980s, I met a novelist whom I knew by reputation, a happy bullshit artist, and those beats who made careers in academic posts by writing out the ambiguity of whether they'd actually had Kerouac sleep on their couch. When I was 22, the novelist was in his 60s. He was talking to a beautiful woman who held her drink with both hands and who regarded him with suspicion, like he was about to offer her candy. As I was walking by, he brought me into the conversation, which I recognized as a gambit to make her reduce her grip on her glass to one hand, to let the other settle to her hip. "Excuse me," he said to me. "You look part English." "That's true. Is the other part Jewish?" I asked that as a full Jew myself. "It is." "I've often thought the combination of English and Ashkenazi Jew makes the most handsome man in the room. Don't you think so?" he asked the girl. She was noncommittal. "This fine woman," he said a moment later, "still hasn't decided to leave her husband for me, but I can't blame her." "The question is," I said, "whether she's going to expand her horizons or let them stay as they are." He started to say something he'd prepared, but he faltered. The conversation continued the way he was driving it as before, but his interest in her, obligatory as it already was complicated by this: I wasn't a chump. I'd been moderately funny, but I hadn't tried to compete. I was staying in the conversation to make him look good. That's a set of skills that develops in unusual circumstances. After the woman left for better prospects, he wanted to know about me. "How did you come to San Francisco?" he asked. "My mother met a man at the Mark Hopkins Hotel," I said. And when that was all I said, he laughed. "What is it about the Mark Hopkins?" I said, "She met a man who said he wanted to buy her a balloon and take her to Paris." I have to stop short my writer's memory, the desire to underline. I can't claim that he froze his wrist just as the drink was about to meet his lips. "I think I knew that man," he said. "You knew Peter Charming?" When he spoke again, it was with caution. "Do you know where he is still? Are you friends with his people?" "No, not anymore," I said. It was unnerving to see a man like the novelist, whose identity pivoted on tall tales, sweep my eyes with conviction to see if I was telling the truth. How would he even know if I was sincere? He asked my mother's name. I told him. He squinted. Vaguely, he thought he remembered her, but he wasn't sure. "Is your mother all right?" "No." "I'm sorry." I'm never sure what to say when people have to say that about her. Finally, he said, "Peter Charming was doing terrible things." "I know." "You knew?" He looked alarmed. It was as if I were aware of atrocities, but done nothing. "It was the 70s, he said. And some of us fell victim to improving ourselves in ways that turned out silly. It was a silly decade. People took advantage of that. Charming was bad. I heard bad things. Like what? I asked. Human trafficking. I'd seen some things, but no, I hadn't seen that. I wanted the conversation to last longer, but another woman walked by, as pretty as the last, and in mid-sentence the novelist waved her down, introducing us. He told her I was his son. As I shook hands with her, he made up a biography for me. I was the spawn of his second marriage. I was out from Cleveland. I was on the crew team in my college. Didn't I look just like him? As he spun the story, I went along with it. He said my mother, his ex-wife, was English, and he felt that the combination of English and Ashkenazi Jew was the most handsome on earth. Hadn't he done right by me? Wasn't I a wonder? Later, I phoned my mother to tell her much of this conversation. I treated our talks back then like trips down hallways with certain rooms under lock and key, but I didn't think about why I was so careful. I told her about the novelist introducing me as his son, which she found delightful. I didn't tell her he'd asked if she was okay, or that I'd said she wasn't. What did he say about Peter? She asked. He said Peter was involved in human trafficking? I rarely speak with that kind of uptick, but I was asking a question as subtly as I knew how, which was not very subtly at all. What were Peter's limits? She answered in a way that I would have said I felt nothing about. Oh, Peter. You know, it was just so hard to stay mad at him. He was like a big kid. And there it was. That statement I felt nothing about. Remembered for decades when I'd forgotten the details of birthdays and first kisses. How did I really feel? I felt a dry, hot, constricting tension that I did not allow dominion over me. I felt like I wanted the conversation to be over so I could tell people about it and read from their faces how I should feel too. Might it be disturbing that my mother had suggested human trafficking was forgivable, if not childlike? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I'm looking for confirmation. I look to you. You nod. I nod back. Yes, that's pretty bad. How do you feel, Glenn, about a man you knew well, perhaps being the worst sort of human being? With pride in my voice at my own detachment, I would say nothing. And upon your suggestion, probably unspoken, probably just a puzzled squint that I'm trained to look for, that someone more fully aware might feel something, I would think, no, I'm too strong for that. Nothing can touch me. And that reaction is what this story is about. For much of my life, there's been a circuitous pathway between when something happens and when I react. This gives the illusion of stillness, when in fact, it's about trying to accommodate too much at once. I do not have feelings so much as I gauge what a loved one would want me to feel, and then I tell myself about that. Perhaps that's familiar to you. Have you ever used a key on the lock of an old mountain cabin, felt it stick, and tried to imagine its teeth engaging tumblers? Have you tried making friends with its unknowable history, coaxing it into unfreezing? And have you promised yourself you will not give in to a burst of anger that could snap it in half? Then you know what it's like to be my mother's son. It's exhausting. It's where art forms are born. I think Baroque draftsmen who made etchings of labyrinths were men raised by shattered women. Peter Charming is part of the story, but really, I'm looking for my mother or what remains of her. There's not going to be redemption here, nor am I going to indict her as a monster. There's another way to go for those of us who can no longer love our mothers. I've learned compassion for her, what an old friend calls compassion from a distance. My mother's life has been a tragedy, but mine has not. And let's be honest here, my mother isn't the story either. I'd like to tell you about myself, which embarrasses me, the way my needing anything always does. I place a high value on autonomy. When I was so young that my memories were hardly even meant to be permanent, 3 or 4 years old, My parents and I were watching television. I saw actors talking to camera. It impressed my parents. They said there was something sophisticated in admitting the scene had an audience. So while I was hammering the flippers of my pinball machine or sinking shampoo bottles in the bathtub as if they were my great-grandfather's U-boat, I began talking to camera myself. I knew it wasn't real, but it was also as vivid as the adventures I gave my stuffed kangaroo. When I was alone in a room, I was never alone, for there was an audience I was meant to entertain. And after I was put to bed, time and again, my mother or father had to come in the room to tell me to be quiet, because I was still telling the events of the day to my invisible confederates, whom I loved for giving me a purpose. There was a rule I hewed to like it was superstition. In bed, lights out, I only had to talk until I described my day well enough that it felt true. There was a comforting assurance that if I told the story right, I could finally go to sleep. And that feeling has never left me. Now I tell myself that if what I say here is true, I will be complete. And that is what I'm looking for too. Okay. Hello over there. Hey. Good. You look like juror 1. Sure. Oh, yeah. That's fine. So I'd like to explain a little bit about what this book is. It is 3 volumes in one, so it is a bargain, is what I am saying, at only $29.95. And here's how it worked out. My father one day made $5 million in 1969. He pioneered the use of cassette tape, changing America over from reel to reel to cassette, and he immediately signed up the most popular artist in America in the 1960s, which was, of course, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. And he continued to hold on to the money until another day in 1972 when Herb Alpert was driving down the Pacific Coast Highway listening to one of the tapes and it jammed. And then he put in another tape and it jammed too. And it turned out my dad was a great salesman and a pretty crappy engineer. So Herb Alpert pulled out and we lost every penny we had and more. We were completely in the hole. But by then my parents were already getting divorced. And when my mother and I moved up to San Francisco together, one day when I was 12, I came home from school to find out my mother had moved to New York without telling me. So I lived on my own for on and off for about 4 months. And that's the first volume of the book. I started at that point trying to find, now I know, started to find families in places. And I put myself into boarding school. And then I started working at an independent bookstore in Westwood, California, the late lamented Hunter's Books, which is kind of the last Viking funeral-style bookstore of where it didn't really matter if they actually provided any customer service as long as the people there were quirky enough. And I worked with a lot of conceptual artists and performance artists, and there was a guy there who had imaginary children. And we all thought the children were real, and after he got fired, the children started writing me letters that were actually filled with great advice and also about their adventures with what they were doing with Prince Charles. That's how I kind of found out about fiction being a vital way that you can extend your life in some ways. Then, when I was 22, the very same week that I met a woman that I thought I was going to marry, my mother met her own soulmate, who was a crystal meth addict, who was violent and illiterate, and my age, too. So the end of the book is about how my own relationship crashed and burned as hers just flourished all the way until the finale. And I found a place where I had to take a step back and realized that there was nothing I could do to love her on her terms, and I sort of backed off a little bit. My publicist at one point said, well, can you make that into a sentence? 175,000 words into one sentence. So I gave it a shot, except it was a really bad idea. It's a pretty accurate sentence, but wow, it had some downside to it. So I tried it out once there's a bar in San Francisco called Cafe Tosca, right across from City Lights. It's one of those old Italian-style bars. And I was sitting up there talking to a woman who's also an artist. We just met there, and we were chatting along, and she was showing me her art. She asked me, hey, what's your memoir about? I said, well, in fact, it's about how I learned it was wise that I should probably no longer love my mother. Pow! Hits me right in the shoulder. You will never have a satisfying relationship if you do not love your mother. It's like, well, I didn't have satisfying relationships when I did. So it's not so much about turning my back as it is about taking a step away and having what I called in that beginning compassion from a distance. There's people who set the terms where you do everything you can, and you might have that sort of biological ache, but there's just nothing you can do about it. And you sort of have to find a way that you can be true to yourself. And that's basically where we get to in here. And Knopf talked me off of making it 7 volumes, and just 3, which I think was wise. I have a very good editor there. And I think that brings us up to date pretty much at this point here. And I'm very happy to read aloud it to you. And if you have any questions of any sort, I'm very happy to hear them.
I'm curious, 2 things. First of all, other memoirs that you've liked that may have inspired you or influenced your writing.
Yeah.
And what made you decide to put it into a public forum like that?
Yeah, 2 excellent questions. I'll probably kind of answer them together. When I was in my 20s and early 30s, I had a really hardcore anti-memoir bias. I had felt that fiction was art and memoir was kind of an admission you didn't have enough of imagination to make your life into art. And that also it was like, well, here are the great paintings I made. Now here are the brushes I used to make them with, and so it took, I enrolled at a school that was taught by Jeffrey Wolfe, who wrote a book called The Duke of Deception, which is one of the great contemporary memoirs. It's about unraveling his con man father's life and understanding what it was about. And that was a huge inspiration to me. It was about double checking his own memories against other people's and against documents and figuring out all the different ways his father had lied to him. That was very inspirational to me. Other memoirs that really influenced me were kind of weird and all over the place. I'm a big fan of a book called Rat Girl by Kristen Hirsch, who she formed a band called Throwing Muses. And it's about how, it's been a while, so I might get the specifics of this wrong, but she was about 15 riding her bicycle, hit by a car, goes into a coma, comes out of the coma with a song in her head, and had never written a song before, couldn't place the song, so she forms a band to play the song. And when she finally gets it right, the song stops. She doesn't hear it in her head anymore. There's another song in there instead. And it's a fascinating bit of creativity and madness and growing up. It's a terrific book. And then another book that was really inspirational to me was, of all things, the Memoirs of Casanova, the 12-volume version, the unexpurgated version. Expurgated not so much for the sexual content, which is but the way he thought in such a secular way in a time when he wasn't supposed to be doing it. It's sort of like, it's kind of the equivalent of you're in a carriage going across Europe and you just happen to be sitting next to the most fascinating conversationalist of all time, and you get out of the carriage and it turns out all of his stories check out and were completely true. And so I liked that he had a very adventurous life and that he wasn't afraid to make himself the protagonist in a way. So those were things that I dug. The reason that I ended up making it public is that I kept running into people. I tend to have a soft spot in my heart for people who've seen some shit. And people who are shaped by trauma have like kind of a way of recognizing each other somehow. And you can you can sense it with each other that other people have seen something, and that usually it's something that other people can't, it's hard to take in, especially as fiction. When I was 19, I took a writing class with a writer named Ishmael Reed at Berkeley. And Ishmael had this really great and completely unfair assignment for all the 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, which was first person, opposite sex point of view story. 100% failure rate. None of us could at the time imagine what it was like. And so I cheated. I took my mother's letters and I typed them up. I kind of put a plot in there somehow, but basically I just used her diction, her language, her sentences, and just started in. And I got a C-, and I was told no woman ever thought that way. As soon as I saw that, I thought, okay, this is my mother's life doesn't actually make sense in a conventional way. I have to figure this out a bit. And I kept at it. I kept trying to figure it out. And then I wrote a draft of the first part of the book, with the Last Kings of San Francisco, the part where I was 12. And this was fairly recently. It was about 5 years ago I got to that place. And I gave it to my agent. And my agent read it, and she called me up, started giving me notes. So 45 minutes of notes later, she's done. And she said, "Do you have any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, did you like anything?" And she paused, and she said, "Honey, don't ever change your font." So that was kind of a blow, but it was like, it made me, I have one of these crazy things that people tell me something is impossible, I sort of keep going. And so I started signing up for open mic nights in the local cafes and stuff. And I would, in the afternoon, write something and bring it to an audience, and I'd listen for room tone and see when people reacted. And it turned out people reacted when I was most emotionally bare, or tried to account for how I was actually feeling rather than being like a floating eye over everything. I think that I had mistakenly believed memoir was, I won't tell you how I feel, I'll let you guys have all the feelings so I don't need to have them, which surprisingly turns out not to work. But once I started hearing the response, it's the same sort of thing as this alphabet of trauma. Once you start engaging it, it's like you start seeing it everywhere. And I just wanted people to know they're not alone in some kind of way, and that's why it ended up being out there in the world. I hope, does that work? Is that we good? Sure, thanks. Yeah.
First of all, congratulations to getting to a place of compassion.
Thank you.
Even distance compassion, which seems wisest in this context. And from your last comment, it seems like your compassion extends beyond that. That you want to connect with others who have suffered similarly. I find it ingenious that you, at an early age, in the absence of necessary mirroring in the storytelling, found a technique of sort of doing your own mirroring. But my question is, did I see you were preceded this by 2 novels. Did the novel writing help you to move into the memoir writing, and if so, how?
Did the novel? That's an interesting question. I'm going to say I did. I had that thing. There's that alleged fear of how a photograph will steal your soul. I think that a lot of fiction writers fear that memoir will steal their material in some kind of way. So I probably tried to use the details of my life in the world of historical fiction somewhat. But what prepared me for it was that I think that my characters, as well as they came off in the historical fiction, I understood that there was a piece missing that was restored over a series of drafts, so that I don't think it wasn't apparent to readers so much as it was to me that first drafts had a real problem connecting with interiors. Like I think that I used to think anytime people argued, they floated over things. I thought it was just automatic. I didn't think people actually had emotions when they were arguing. It was just, so it took me a while. Lots of therapy. That's the thing that actually got me to this place, was a very patient therapist and some EMDR and stuff like that. But I'm very glad that it comes across as compassionate. That really is my goal. Yeah. It's tough. What I keep on saying is that my people are the ones for whom, when I say the word maternal, I have to add, I mean in a good way. Yeah. Well, if we're all good, that's good. Well, thank you very much for coming out. I really enjoyed being out here tonight. Thank you for having me. Thank you.